So hello everyone, thank you for letting me give my talk pre-recorded today. So I'm currently in Australia, so the time zones wouldn't really have worked out. So today I'm going to be talking about using lead isotopes to unravel the evolution of all forming regions during the Archean. So my research is focused on using big isotopic data sets, and in this case, lead isotope data, to try and address one of the overarching goals of Metal Earth. And that is, if we assume that Precambrian geodynamic environments and processes are different from those operating today, what are the processes that resulted in early Earth's metal endowment, and how can we recognise these? So what I'm trying to look at is whether there's something unique about Archean geodynamic settings in general, or is this specific to certain locations or regional settings? And we can look at isotopic and deposit data through time to address some of these questions. And we can also look spatially in a global context to see what we can apply regionally to the Superior Province. And so isotope data sets are a great way of unraveling crustal and mantle evolution and for understanding ancient processes that we can no longer see on the Earth's surface today. So isotopes such as neodymium, hafnium and strontium, these are all commonly used for differentiating different sources. So for example, juvenile versus evolved sources. But lead isotopes are more sensitive to crustal contamination. So they allow us to understand some of the more subtle and sensitive crust mantle processes. And lead isotopes are typically or historically have been used at the deposit scale for understanding the evolution of ore systems. But at a slightly larger scale, there's beginning to be a bit of a pattern between certain lead isotope values and more endowed terrains. And so here I've just plotted up a figure from David Houston's paper from 2014. And this is really just showing the relationship between lead isotope values, so what we call mu values, and how they relate to different VMS deposits. So there's starting to emerge a pattern that we can start to look at in more detail. And so my research is working on using lead isotopes to understand the geodynamic evolution of different Precambrian terrains and seeing how this links to mineralization. And in doing this, we're really taking a data systems approach. So because lead isotopes are used in lots of different ore deposit studies, there are lots of data available, and we can begin to use some big data approaches in our work. So a lot of the databases that I'm using have been developed by my colleague Bruce Eglinton at the University of Saskatchewan. And a lot of this data was compiled through several international collaborative initiatives. So these include the IGCP 509 and IGCP 648 projects, as well as data from the GSC World Minerals Database. And so a big chunk of our time over the past year and a bit has been dedicated to getting this database updated for our use. So we've added in several new data sets and made significant updates. So this includes new data from Australia. We've also added in new age data to samples where there's no age information available. We've updated some of the spatial data that was missing, so GPS coordinates. This is really essential for understanding different trends and patterns in a spatial context. And as well as that, because unfortunately we haven't been able to collect new data, which was our initial plan due to the pandemic, we've been bringing in other data sets that are complementary. So for example, we've been using some data sets from the Georock database, which is mostly whole rock data, but we can use this and it complements the lead isotope data we have from ore minerals. So why use lead isotopes? Some of the advantages of working with lead is that these isotopes can be collected from ore minerals as well as feldspars and whole rocks. So typically for isotope systems such as hafnium and neodymium, these are collected from either zircon or whole rock samples. But this makes it difficult to contextualize the ore minerals and the ore systems that are hosted by these rocks. So by using an isotope system where we can get data from the ores themselves, as well as the host rocks and related minerals, we can compare these different environments and the mineral systems evolution a bit more holistically. So just a quick overview on lead isotope systematics. I won't dwell on this too much. So what we're really looking at is lead 207 and lead 206 with respect to common lead, which is lead 204. So lead 207 and lead 206 increase with time compared to 204 because they come from the radiogenic decay of uranium 235 and uranium 238. So on a plot here of, hopefully you can see my laser pointer of 207, 204 versus 206, 204. Something with like an average Earth composition would sort of start here in early Earth's history and generally evolve along this black line to the present day here. And rocks or terrains that have a higher uranium lead ratio, what we'll refer to here as mu, they generally plot above this average Earth line, so these sort of brown dots in the brown line here, and rocks or regions that have a lower uranium lead ratio or mu value, they'll plot down here near this green line and the green dots. But because these ratios change depending on the age of the rocks we're interested in, it makes it difficult to compare different regions over different time periods. And even within the same region, it makes it difficult to track changes over tens of millions of years. So to get around this, basically we can back calculate what the original uranium lead ratio of the source would have been that produced the lead isotope values that we measure. And so you can see on this plot, so instead of doing it in this way, we have sort of a horizontal line for the average Earth composition. So it just makes it easier to see what different regions are doing over time and easier to compare sort of similar aged regions, but of slightly different time periods. And so just to point out a couple of reference lines on here, so anything higher than sort of around 11 is generally considered to be sort of high mu. So these are things that have more of a crustal signature or things that have gone through orogenic processes. And then anything around 9 down here is roughly a mantle signature, and then anything below that, so all these green dots, are quite unique, and it's more difficult to explain how to produce those low values, but I'll get to that shortly. And so then this low mu cluster of values here, a lot of this is what we see in the Superior Province, and I'll zoom in on this shortly. And then this is just to show you the spatial extent of the data that we have in the database for all minerals. So you can see we have lots of data from Canada, especially Superior, lots of data from Europe and from Australia as well, and then like reasonable amount from other areas. Obviously, the more the better. And then, so just looking at the same plot again, this just shows all the data we have in our database, mostly from all minerals, mostly galena. And then this is just showing just the VMS deposits. So while we're considering all the data together, we consider the VMS data to be a bit more reliable. And I'll just quickly, just for one slide, go into why we sort of consider VMS deposits to be a bit more reliable. So they uniquely span more than 75% of Earth's history. So the oldest ones go back to almost 3.5 GA, with the youngest ones being forming today on the sea floor. The VMS deposits contain both felsic and mafic rocks, so we're not limited to one rock type, which could potentially bias our interpretations. We can use these to map ancient oceans and sutures, so there's lots of applications for plate tectonic reconstructions, which is another thing that I sort of work on with colleagues. And VMS deposits form exclusively in oceanic or arc environments, so there's less room for things like contamination or weird signatures that you might get with other deposit types. So we can sort of rely on data from VMS deposits to be sort of accurate representation of the sources that have formed those minerals. And so this is the same plot as before, the mu versus age plot, but instead of just plotting all the points, I've grouped them by each tectonic plate. So the median mu and median age for each tectonic plate. So the main thing to point out here is that all of the Superior data plot here with quite low mu values. Capval in Africa also plots a quite low mu. And another interesting observation that I won't go into too much is the difference here between Slave West, which is all the way up here, and Slave East. And that there are very few VMS or gold deposits in the Slave West region where these data are from. So I guess this raises the question about whether the mu values are somehow fundamentally related to ore forming processes. And I guess that's one of the overarching questions we're trying to answer through this big data approach is there a relationship between sort of low mu signature and more endowed terrains? And I guess before I go too much further, I just want to briefly explain how we actually, in a lead isotope systematics way, how we can explain and produce these low mu values in the Earth, because it is quite unusual. So this will become clearer later, but it is important to understand this to see how the lead isotopic data compare with other isotopic systems such as hafnium and neodymium. So as I showed earlier, this line here is roughly how the average Earth would evolve over time. So I've just zoomed in on the time period that we're interested in here for Superior. And then these grey dots here, they're all the data from Superior. So you can see they form nicely along this sort of 2.7 GA geochron. And they do come down to quite low mu values here. But the important thing to note is that we really need to understand how to generate the lower end of these data. So it's much easier to get high mu values through crustal contamination and things like that. But we really need to know how to get these low values here. So the lower range of these values. So to get a value that deviates away from this average Earth composition curve, we need an event to have occurred a significant amount of time earlier. So here I plotted on a hypothetical source of average Earth composition that gets extracted or sequestered so for example here, 3.2 GA, and it undergoes a uranium lead change which decreases to 2. And so then as this evolves and decays, it will evolve along the trajectory of this orange line, which you can see it will eventually form this composition that we see at Superior. So that's one way of how we could generate the data we see at Superior. Another way would be a hypothetical source that gets extracted a bit earlier, so 3.5 GA. But you don't need as much of a decrease in uranium lead to form this. So hypothetically in this case, it would be a uranium lead ratio of 6, and this can also form it. Likewise, you can have something a bit older with a less extreme lower mu value that also forms this composition. But the key point here really is that it needs time to evolve. So a mu of 2 would be considered sort of quite low, like sort of the extreme end of what would be considered normal. So we're sort of saying it takes at least 500 million years of a source that's been sequestered and isolated from sort of everything else and not interacting with anything to produce the low mu values that we see in Superior. However, this contrasts with the available neodymium and hafnium isotope data, which is all dominantly juvenile, which suggests it's more mantle-like, or it's been sort of sourced straight from the mantle. And then I guess just quickly, there are a few known geological settings or geodynamic settings that can produce low mu. None of these really explain what we're seeing, so this is something that we're really going to be working on in the near future. So one process is granulite facies metamorphism. So this is generally in the lower crust, so this drives off uranium, which lowers the uranium lead ratio. Yeah, so basically the lower crust. There are also known low uranium lead ratios in some mafic garnet peroxenite xenoliths. So that's one possible source that could produce low mu values. But we really need to understand what settings can produce low mu, but at the same time produce juvenile neodymium and hafnium. So it's something that's sort of affecting the lead, but not really affecting these other isotopic systems. So to look into this issue further, was our initial plan and goal of the whole project really was to collect new lead data from samples with existing neodymium or hafnium data. But Sadly, due to the pandemic, we just haven't been able to collect any new data or even get into the labs to start the process. So hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to do this though, and then that'll sort of tighten up all the interpretations and the stuff that I'm presenting today. So in the meantime though, we can use some existing data sets to see trends more broadly. So David Moll has done some really fantastic work in collecting a huge amount of hafnium isotope data. So this is generally restricted to the Abitibi-Wawa region, but it has really good spatial density, so we can look at trends there. Also, we can use the whole rock databases such as Georock, which contains neodymium isotope data, as well as lead isotope data collected from whole rock samples. And this is also really useful for comparing the ore data with the host rocks to see if the signatures are the same or different. And then so this is just zooming in on Superior to show all the data we have in our ore database from this region. And you can see we have quite a lot here that's highlighted by these green dots through here. So these, all the green ones are low mu, all the grey ones are sort of average, and then the brown ones are what we would consider high mu. And so this region here in particular has lots of samples with low mu. And we don't have a lot of spatial coverage in the rest of Superior away from the deposits. Obviously, it's harder to find ore minerals away from the deposits. So we can't really show whether the low mu is restricted to kind of what appears like this band or whether it's more widespread. So this is really what we need, why we need more data to have better spatial coverage. But just to compare with some other isotopic data, so this here is hafnium isotope data from David Moll, and this has just been published this year, like in the last couple of weeks, which is an amazing data set of there's hafnium, but also compiled neodymium and geochemistry data. And so basically here, anything that's sort of darker is more juvenile or mantle-like, but generally this whole region is quite juvenile. So the interpretation would be that these would be sourced from the mantle or something mantle-like. And it does kind of appear like those green dots that I just showed before here do correlate with the darker ones here, but really there's not enough data to be able to say this conclusively, but it does kind of lead you to want to look at these areas in a bit more detail or get data in the surrounding regions to sort of see whether that would hold up. And then in terms of Georock lead isotope data, so these are from whole rock samples. There's generally not great spatial coverage through here, but there is quite a bit of data from each of these locations. So it looks better sort of in plot form rather than on maps. But again, we can see that there's low mu values, roughly where we saw the low mu values from the ore data. Oh, and here I've just quickly plotted up the Georock data compared to the DepIso ore data. So just to really make the point that so the squares in here are the DepIso ore data, which form really nicely along like a line at 2.7, which is what we want. And then all the little dots there, all the Georock data, and you can see there's a huge spread here, and that's because they're more radiogenic. They're not like pure lead samples. They have lots of other bits of uranium and stuff in them that decay through time. Anyway, I just really wanted to make the point that while we can use the whole rock data broadly, it's certainly not as precise or reliable as the sulfide data. So, but together we can use these data sets. Together they work quite well and they're complementary. And then here I've just plotted up the Georock neodymium data set, which has a bit more spatial coverage compared to the lead. And this really highlights sort of what we saw in the hafnium data. So especially here, these are quite juvenile. These sort of above 0 would be considered quite juvenile. And yeah, we just see that in the neodymium as well as the hafnium. And then I guess just to show this sort of in plot form, so using the Georock data, I've just plotted here mu versus epsilon neodymium. And so we can see the whole rock data is broadly low mu values. So that's comparable to the ore data, which is good. It just shows that the host rocks aren't drastically different from the ore minerals in terms of their lead isotope compositions. And generally speaking, low mu here, anything less than this solid line is considered sort of lower than average Earth, this correlates to more juvenile neodymium. So again, anything sort of above 0 in neodymium space would be considered quite juvenile or mantle-like. So looking at the lead isotope data in a bit more of a temporal context, so in David Moll's recent paper, he plotted up these different events through here, which I think looked quite nice and added a bit more context to the data. So you guys will be much more familiar with all these than I am. But generally speaking, the lower mu values do tend to increase slightly with time. And by plotting it this way, it also highlights obvious gaps for further data acquisition. So for example, these between 2695 and 2670, there's a huge gap in the sulfide data here. So we'd be great to collect more data from there. But yeah, generally there's just sort of this slight increase in trend. I've also plotted up all the whole rock Georock data here. So remember, these are whole rock samples, so they're less reliable than the ore samples, and that's why there's a much broader range compared, like all these ranges are much more than the ore data. But again, generally this is the same trend of sort of increasing mu through time. And an interesting interpretation from David Moll's work is that leading up to 2695 million years ago, the region is dominated by plume rift tectonics, and then leading eventually to subduction zone tectonics after this time period. So this lead isotope data is broadly consistent with that interpretation at around this time. And here, for example, we see a much more crustal or orogenic signature in the whole rock data, which would be consistent with more subduction zone type tectonics. But really we'd want to see this sort of pattern here in the ore lead data to be confident with this interpretation. But once we start to fill in some of these data gaps, both spatially and temporally, we should be able to test some of the interpretations using the lead data for both Superior and other regions around the world. So I haven't touched on too much about the other regions we're looking at, but we're really interested in sort of Archean regions globally. But we have lots of data from Superior, so that's why we're able to look at it in a bit more detail like this. Yeah, so just to sum up really, so the Superior Province ore and host rocks have low mu isotope signatures. This contrasts or kind of contradicts with the relatively more mantle-like neodymium and hafnium signatures. And to produce the low mu values we see, we require a lead source that has evolved over several hundreds of millions of years, but a neodymium and hafnium source that is relatively juvenile. So the next steps we'll be working on is exploring modern and ancient geological settings that can produce these contrasting isotopic characteristics, as well as finally getting around to collecting the new data as initially planned once we're able to get back into lab access and getting instruments running and things like that. So that's all I have today. So thank you. As I said, this talk's pre-recorded, so if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to catch up for a Zoom meeting or something if anyone wants to discuss anything in more detail. And I'm not sure if Sally Pearson is attending the workshop today, but she might be able to answer any questions as well. Otherwise, please feel free to email me. And thank you.